Welcome, dear viewers, to a gripping tale of love betrayal and the unexpected twists of fate that can lead us to our true destiny. Enjoy the story.
Welcome, dear friends, to a story of second chances and unexpected love that proves it's never too late to become the person you were always meant to be. The 50th floor of the gleaming Prescott Tower was eerily quiet for a Tuesday afternoon. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of Patricia Hawthorne's heels as she made her way down the marble-floored hallway toward the corner office of Brandon Prescott, CEO of Prescott Industries and one of New York's most eligible bachelors. Patricia hesitated at the imposing oak door, preparing herself for the conversation ahead. In her 15 years as Brandon's personal assistant, she delivered all manner of news to her boss: billion-dollar mergers, scandalous tabloid rumors. But this was different. She knocked softly and entered without waiting for a response. Brandon was standing where he always stood at this hour, by the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. At 45, he cut an impressive figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair that only added to his commanding presence. "Mr. Prescott," Patricia began, her voice steady despite the emotions roiling inside her. "I'm afraid I have some news." Brandon didn't turn around. "Unless it's about the Jensen deal, I'm not interested." His tone was curt, as usual. Patricia took a deep breath. "It's about Claire, sir. Your ex-wife." At this, Brandon's shoulders stiffened. Slowly, he turned, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. "Claire? What could she possibly want after all these years?" She's passed away, sir," Patricia said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and oppressive. For a moment, Brandon's carefully maintained facade slipped, revealing a mix of shock, pain, and something else, perhaps guilt. But just as quickly, the vulnerability vanished, replaced by his usual stoic demeanor. "I see," he said, his voice emotionless. "And why exactly are you telling me this?" Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "Well, sir, as her legal husband, you're responsible for the funeral arrangements. Her neighbors, they can't afford it." "Her neighbors?" Brandon scoffed. "What family?" "Claire was an orphan, Patricia. She didn't have anyone." "I meant the people she's been living with, sir," Patricia clarified. "They've been taking care of her. They just don't have the means." Brandon waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, handle it. Use the company account if you must, but keep it quiet. The last thing I need is the press getting wind of this." Patricia nodded, relieved that he wasn't putting up more of a fight. But as she turned to leave, Brandon's voice stopped her. "And Patricia," he added, his tone sharp, "I won't be attending." She turned back surprised. "Sir, I really think—" "I said no," Brandon snapped, cutting her off. "That chapter of my life is closed." As Patricia left the office, closing the door softly behind her, Brandon turned back to the window. But instead of the glittering cityscape, all he could see was Claire's face. Young, beautiful, and full of life. The face he'd last seen 7 years ago, streaked with tears, pleading for him to understand. He shook his head, banishing the memory. Claire had made her choice, and he had made his. End of story. But as he sat down at his desk, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Somehow, Claire was about to upend his carefully ordered world one last time. That evening, as Brandon nursed a glass of scotch in his penthouse apartment, memories he had long buried began to resurface. He closed his eyes and was transported back to his childhood, a time he had spent running from his mother's anger. Her words echoed in his mind. "You're just like your father, worthless and weak." He had sworn, even as a young boy, that he would never be weak again. He would never let anyone have that kind of power over him, and for years he had succeeded. He had climbed his way out of poverty, built an empire, and become everything his mother had said he'd never be. Then came Claire. He'd met her at a charity gala, one of those events he attended out of obligation. She was working as a waitress, putting herself through art school, and in a room full of superficial socialites, her genuine smile had captivated him. Against his better judgment, he had asked her out. To his surprise, she had said yes. Their whirlwind romance became the talk of the town, the hard-nosed tycoon and the free-spirited artist. It didn't make sense to anyone else, but it worked for them. For the first time in his life, Brandon allowed himself to be vulnerable, to trust someone completely. They were married within 6 months, much to the shock of New York's elite. But there was one condition to their marriage. One line Brandon refused to cross: no children. "I can't risk it, Claire," he had told her the night before their wedding. "I can't risk becoming like her." Claire had been disappointed, he knew that. But she had agreed. "It's okay, Brandon," she had said, cupping his face in her hands. "You're enough for me. You'll always be enough." For 5 years they were blissfully happy, or so Brandon had thought. But then, everything changed. "Brandon, I'm pregnant," Claire had said one night, her eyes shining with a mixture of joy and nervousness. In that moment, all Brandon could hear was his mother's voice, her angry words, her bitterness, her cruelty. Fear gripped him, an irrational panic that clouded his judgment. "How could you do this to me?" he had shouted, his voice tight with anger. "We had an agreement, Claire." Claire had tried to calm him, reaching out to him with tears in her eyes. "Brandon, please. This is a miracle, our miracle. I know you're scared, but..." "Scared?" He had laughed bitterly. "I'm not scared, I'm furious. How long have you been planning this? How long have you been trying to trap me?" Claire had recoiled as if he'd slapped her. "Trap you? Brandon, what are you talking about? This is our child." But Brandon couldn't listen. He was too consumed by fear, by the idea of becoming the very thing he had spent his life running from. "Get out," he had snarled. "Get out of my house, get out of my life. We're done." The next morning, Claire was gone. All that remained was a note on the kitchen counter. "When you're ready to be the man I know you can be, you'll know where to find me." But Brandon had never looked for her. He threw himself into his work, building Prescott Industries into an empire. He dated casually, never letting anyone get close again. He convinced himself he was better off alone. And now Claire was gone for good. The woman he had once loved more than life itself was dead, and he was left with nothing but regret. As dawn's light began creeping into his apartment, Brandon made a decision. He would attend the funeral. Not for Claire, he told himself, but for closure. To finally put that chapter of his life behind him, once and for all. The day of Claire's funeral was gray and dreary, as if the sky itself was in mourning. Brandon stood at the edge of the small gathering, feeling out of place in his expensive suit. The turnout was smaller than he had expected. A handful of people, mostly elderly women, gathered around the simple wooden casket. There were no flowers, no elaborate headstone, just a quiet farewell. Brandon felt a twinge of something, guilt, perhaps, regret. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the whispers around him. Isn't that Brandon Prescott? What's he doing here? Patricia appeared at his side, always anticipating his needs before he could express them. "Everything's been arranged, sir," she murmured. "We can leave whenever you're ready." Brandon nodded, already turning to go. He had made his appearance, paid his respects such as they were. It was time to return to the real world of board meetings and billion-dollar deals. But just as he was about to leave, a voice stopped him. "Excuse me, are you Brandon Prescott?" He turned to see an elderly woman approaching him, her face lined with sorrow. "Yes," he replied stiffly. "And you are?" "Margaret," she said. "I was Claire's neighbor. She lived with me these past few years." Brandon blinked in surprise. Claire had lived with this elderly woman? Before he could respond, Margaret's expression changed, her voice growing firm. "There's someone you need to meet." She gestured to someone standing behind her, and that's when Brandon's world tilted on its axis. A little girl, no more than 6 or 7, stepped forward. She had Claire's golden curls, her delicate features, but her eyes, those eyes were Brandon's, steel gray and serious. "This is Sophie," Margaret said gently. "She's your daughter."